The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week, we're learning about the fascinating lives of bees and the important role they play in our global ecosystem. Hello and welcome to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell. I'm joined today by Professor Dave Goulson. Dave was brought up in rural Shropshire, where he developed an early obsession with wildlife. He received his bachelor's degree in biology from Oxford University, followed by a doctorate on butterfly ecology at Oxford Brookes University. Subsequently, he lectured in biology for 11 years at the University of Southampton, and it was there that he began to study bumblebees. He's published more than 200 scientific articles on the ecology and conservation of bumblebees and other insects, and he's the author of a number of books on the topic as well. He's here to talk about A Sting in the Tail, my adventures with bumblebees. Dave, thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure.
Now, how did your overwhelming interest in insects begin?
I don't actually know. As early as I can remember, when I was, I guess my earliest memories are sort of 5, 6, I was already hooked. I remember catching anything I could catch, and actually I think most kids do this, don't they? That they love to hunt for bugs, stick them in jam jars, put them on the windowsill and feed them things and look after them and whatever. My own kids do it now, but somehow I managed to carry on doing it into my until I'm nearly 50 now, and I've been doing it my whole life, and thankfully managed to make a living out of it, so I guess I'm quite lucky.
What is it about them that's so interesting?
I mean, it's like a little alien world, that we're surrounded by these creatures, and there's enormous numbers of them, different species. 3/4 of life on Earth are insects of one sort or another, and people often pay them no attention at all. Most people go through their whole lives barely noticing these things, and yet they're all around us. They do all sorts of important things. They do really weird and wonderful and interesting things, and it's just fun to find out about them and to watch them and see what they do.
Let's talk about why bees are so fascinating. Maybe to start off, can you just walk us through the life cycle of a bee?
When you say a bee, what I first need to explain is that there's an awful lot of bees. Many, many people think there's one species of bee and it lives in a box and it makes honey. That's a million miles from the truth. I mean, actually, there are 22,000 species of bee in the world, so I can't tell you the life cycle of the bee because there are so many of them. But what I maybe could do is tell you the life cycle of the bumblebee, which is my speciality, and they're perhaps the most familiar of the wild bees. So they're the big, furry, stripy bees that we see in our gardens and parks and fields and so on. They have a life cycle. They're probably best to pick it up in early spring when you get these great big fat queen bees emerge from hibernation. They've been asleep underground all winter, and they burrow up out the ground on the first warm day of spring, and you see these enormous things flying about, and they're desperately hungry because they've been asleep for 7 months, and so they feed on anything they can find in the early spring. And then they look for somewhere to nest, and you see them flying backwards and forwards low to the ground, and they're looking for a hole. They're hoping to find a dry, dark, cozy cavity they can nest in, and if they find one, then they'll fly in and out and stock it with pollen, and they'll lay a little batch of eggs, and they incubate their batch of eggs they literally sit on it, and they push their tummy against it, and they shiver to keep warm and to keep their brood warm. And if all goes well, a few weeks later, they have adult daughter bees that are workers. They don't themselves ever breed, but their job is to look after the nest and their mum, and to bring in more food. And so the nest grows through the spring, and eventually it might have 200 or 300 workers. And then in the summer, it switches from producing workers to producing males and new queens. And the males, their only job in life is to mate with a new queen. They don't do any work in the nest. They don't gather food or anything. They just sit around on flowers and occasionally dash frantically around trying to find a female to mate with. The females, they mate really quickly, and they just mate once in their whole life, which means that actually that many of those males, they never actually get to mate at all. There are about 7 times as many males as there are queens, and the queens only mate once, so it means that 6 out of 7 males actually never get to do the one thing that they're meant to do, which is kind of sad. Anyway, as soon as they've mated, the new queens, they burrow into the ground, and this can be as early as July, and they sleep right through to the next year, and the old nest just dies off. The old queen dies, all the workers slowly fizzle out, and that's the annual cycle of the bumblebee.
Now, the queen bees are able to choose the specific role of the bees by choosing the gender of their offspring?
The genetics of bees and their relatives, the wasps and ants, is pretty weird. Basically, a female bee can control whether she produces a son or a daughter by simply controlling whether she allows the egg to be fertilized or not. So she stored this sperm inside her from when she mated the previous summer, and she can control, every time she lays an egg, she can control whether it's fertilized as it comes out. If it's fertilized, it'll turn into a daughter. If it's not, it'll turn into a son. Which is rather weird. I mean, it actually means that the male bees have no father genetically at all. They are entirely produced by their mother. One of the strange consequences of this weird genetic system is that the daughters are much more closely related to one another than the normal brothers and sisters in, for example, humans or butterflies or most organisms. So you and I are 50% related to our siblings, but if you were a female bee, you'd be 75% related to your sisters. And so that kind of quirk of genetics has favoured the evolution of this social lifestyle. So essentially what a bumblebee nest is, it's a gang of sisters all helping their mother produce more sisters. And the reason they're kind of predisposed to do that is because they're very closely related to their sisters, more closely than they would be to their own offspring, for example. And so in terms of maximizing the number of kind of genetic copies of their DNA there are in the world, it's a better strategy than it would be in other organisms.
Well, and the bee mating process itself is interesting. Can you talk about patrolling and hilltopping?
Bumblebees have various strange ways of finding mates. There are lots of different ones, but probably the best known was described by Charles Darwin in his back garden. And basically what they do is that early in the morning, the male bees go out and they mark a route with pheromones. They'll go around maybe 200-yard circuit, often following hedges and tree lines and so on. And every few meters, they'll paste pheromones from they're produced in their mandibular glands in their head, and their jaws have little kind of moustaches on them that they could use as paintbrushes to paste these pheromones onto leaves. So they make this sort of circuit marked with pheromones. And it's not just one male, a whole gang of them will mark out the same route together. And then at some point in the day, something will trigger them, and they'll all start racing round this circuit flat out. So if you stand at any point on it, you see this stream of frantic male bees whizzing past one after another, going round and round and round in this kind of crazy circle. And so Darwin, he's got his children, he had lots of children, and he dotted them all the way round the circuit and had them shout every time a bee came past. And he even actually got them with sugar shakers, sugar sprinklers, filled with flour, trying to sprinkle flour onto these male bees so they could see them more easily. They make them like little ghost bees. And so he tracked these things in his garden, and he found that actually what's quite weird is that males will use the same route in successive years. So he had the same route being used in his garden. Obviously completely different males. How they could possibly know that this was a good route or that it was used the year before is anyone's guess. So anyway, look, quite a few male bumblebees do this. Nobody really knows how it works, so it must be something to do with attracting a mate. But nobody's ever seen a virgin female come along and mate with one of these mad males. So it's kind of puzzling. I mean, I'm sure they do, and it's probably something that happens very quickly. And obviously, people don't have the time to sit there all day long watching this behaviour and observing if just once in a blue moon a female does come along. So I guess that it does happen, but I've never seen it. And then other males of different species have different strategies, and there are all sorts of different ones. One of the commonest is hilltopping, where the males basically they just fly uphill And inevitably that means that they end up congregated at the tops of the nearest hills. And I had some undergraduate students do their projects on this. And they went every day walking up the sides of mountains and found these kind of gangs of males sitting around on flowers at the tops of the hills. The same behaviour, actually, you can see it in some butterfly species. And again, what's presumed to happen, and this definitely is the case in butterflies, is that when a female wants to mate, if she wants to find a male and have a nice selection of males to choose from, all she has to do is fly to the top of the nearest hill, and there'll be a gang of males sitting there waiting for her. And it gives her a selection to choose from. Presumably, again, that's what's happening with bumblebees. But once again, we've never actually seen a female go up the hill to find one of these males. So who knows? But we assume it's a mechanism for locating a mate.
Well, I found it interesting because it seems to be that hilltopping is not very competitive, which is unusual.
Well, both of these things are kind of interesting because they both involve gangs of males being together, which you'd kind of intuitively think that seems like quite a poor strategy for getting a mate, because if one does come along, you've got loads of competition. But it may be that you've got no chance of getting a mate if you're not in one of these gangs. So you know, even it's better than nothing. And there's been research on other creatures in this respect. So there are things called leks, which there are quite a few birds that do this, and some mammals as well. But a lek is basically an aggregation of males, and so for example, grouse well known for doing this. And the males are very pretty, they have elaborate plumage and whatnot. And every spring in the breeding season, they'll gather together in some completely random location. It doesn't need to be the top of a hill. And they'll all display like crazy. And the females can come along and they can basically watch all the males and can sort of, you know, take notes, compare, and eventually decide which is the most attractive, splendid, whatever, who's got the nicest feathers, whatever it is a female grouse looks for in a male grouse. So from her point of view, it's great. It gives her a selection. But again, you know, the question is what's in it for the males? And I suppose you could see it. It's like a nightclub, although there are lots of men perhaps looking for women in a nightclub. If you don't go to the nightclub, then you're probably even less likely to find an available woman. I don't know. I'm maybe wandering into territory that is not strictly relevant to bee mating behaviour. But yeah, we assume that these behaviours must ultimately be, you know, work for these male bees, but it's slightly puzzling.
This is Science for the People, and I'm speaking with Dave Goulson, author of A Sting in the Tail, My Adventures with Bumblebees. Okay, well, I want to switch tracks just because I want to do some bumblebee myth debunking. We have all heard people say, potentially on the internet, that bumblebee flight violates the laws of physics, and as that is patently untrue, I'd like you to explain it.
No one has ever tracked down the original source of this legendary, mythical statement about bees. Everyone's heard it, but everyone's heard it fifth hand, and nobody can tell you who first said it. It's kind of like an urban legend or something. And clearly it isn't true. Obviously bees manage to fly perfectly well. But as far as I know, no physicist has actually sat down and tried to, you know, model the principles of bumblebee flight and demonstrate that according to our current understanding of physics, they shouldn't be able to fly. I think it's actually the whole thing is just complete nonsense. But it's one of these things that's sort of self-perpetuating and won't go away.
One of the things that I found so interesting about your book is that they have a very high body temperature because of the way they fly.
I remember being taught in my biology lessons when I was at school that insects are cold-blooded. You know, that mammals and birds are warm-blooded, which basically means that they generate heat. We generate heat internally, muscles and metabolic action and so on. And then we regulate our body temperature. So we sweat and we shiver and we do all sorts of things to keep our body temperature more or less stable. Whereas insects and reptiles and so on, their body temperature is largely kind of determined by the ambient temperature around them, and all they can do to warm themselves up is to bask in the sun on a warm day, and in that way they can get warm enough to be active and so on. And that's why insects generally tend to be active in sunny weather and so on. All makes perfect sense. But for some insects, insects. It just isn't true, and bumblebees are one of these exceptions. So bumblebees, they produce most of their heat internally, just like we do. The middle of the bee, the central section of the thorax, is full of flight muscles. When they're flying, they flap their wings very fast, about 200 times a second, which generates lots of heat from these flight muscles, and the fur on the outside of a bumblebee helps to keep that in. And they regulate their temperature. They have all sorts of mechanisms. They can cool themselves down if they need to. And in fact, their body temperature, when a bumblebee is active, she'll regulate her body temperature at about 35 degrees centigrade, so pretty close to a human body temperature. And that gives them big advantages over other insects, because it means they can fly around in cold weather. And actually, in Britain now, we have one species of bumblebee that's given up hibernating, and you can see them for 12 months of the year. I've got them in my back garden in the last few days. So they can keep their body temperature about 30 degrees centigrade elevated above the air temperature. And they can live high up in the mountains. You get them in the Rockies, right up in the Alps. You get bumblebees living in the Arctic Circle. They can come out really early in the spring when most insects, it's just too cold for them to take off, and so on. But there is a kind of downside to all of this, which is that it uses huge amounts of energy, all this keeping warm when you're very small and flapping their wings very fast and everything else. An analogy that kind of quite nicely illustrates how energetically expensive it is for a bumblebee to fly is that someone once calculated that a running man has to burn off the calories in a Mars bar. Do you have Mars bars over there?
I do.
You do. Excellent. So to burn off the calories in a Mars bar, you have to run for an hour, which is kind of pretty depressing if you're trying to lose weight by running. If you happen to be a man-sized bumblebee, which would be pretty exciting, then it would take you just 30 seconds of flying to burn off the calories in a Mars bar. So basically, although it gives them, it's a neat trick and it means they can fly in cold weather, it does mean that they need piles of food. They basically need a lot of sugary nectar to keep them in the air. And if they can't find enough flowers, then they're in big trouble.
So you said that there haven't been basically any studies on how bees fly, but there have been a tremendous number of studies on bee navigation, and some of them you've been involved in.
Yeah. So one of the really clever things that bees do is they navigate long distances across the landscape, backwards and forwards from, they leave their nest, they go out and search for patches of flowers. They can go several miles from their nest if they need to find a good patch of flowers. And then they can find their way back again. And obviously if they get lost, then they're doomed, basically. They've lost their home. They can't build, if it's a worker, then she's had it, basically. But they very rarely do get lost. They have all sorts of clever tricks. They memorize landmarks and the relative position of their nest relative to, say, a tree or a tall building or a lamppost or whatever. They can use the sun as a compass. They can use the Earth's magnetic field as a compass. So they're pretty smart little things. We did some work a long time ago now on their ability to home. So I guess most people are familiar with homing in pigeons, and it's a popular hobby still in some parts of Britain to keep pigeons. And at weekends you drive them 100 miles away and chuck them out of your car, and a couple of hours later they turn up back at home. They're really impressive. So we tried doing similar things with bumblebees. I had some bumblebee nests in my back garden, and I captured workers as they were coming out of the nest and drove them around the countryside and released them out of the window of my car. And I did individually put little numbered tags on their backs so I could tell which bee was which. And then I'd race home and sit outside their nests waiting for them to come back and see which ones came back and how far they could get home from, and so on. And some of them would beat me home in my car. They're pretty quick, and there was would get stuck in traffic sometimes, and by the time I get back, the bees would already be there. So yeah, they're pretty smart when you consider how tiny they are. It's amazing the distances that they can navigate over. They put us to shame.
Well, and they seem to understand which flowers have nectar in them and which don't.
Yeah, so this was actually the very first thing I studied with respect to bees. So at the time, I was a kind of a new university lecturer at Southampton Uni about 20 years ago, and I wasn't quite sure what I was doing, to be honest. And I didn't really have a research program going, and I was kind of a man in search of a mission. And anyway, so I was I found myself watching bees one day in a nature reserve. And I spotted something that I just thought was quite intriguing, and anyone can see this in their back garden. You have to wait till spring now, but when the bees are out and about, if you watch a bee in a patch of flowers, you'll see that she often flies up to flowers, gets very, very close to them, but doesn't quite touch them. She sort of waves her antennae close to them, and then she veers away, and she might approach several flowers before she finds one that she's sort of happy with and lands on and puts her tongue into the flower and drinks the nectar. And I watched this and I thought, well, what are they doing? You know, what's wrong with the flowers that she's sort of rejecting at the last minute? And so I ended up spending 5 years sort of unraveling what was going on. I had a PhD student called Jane Stout, and she did most of her PhD on this. To cut a very long 5-year story rather short, what the bees turns out are doing is they are sniffing the flower for a whiff of bee. Every time a bee lands on a flower, she leaves, just as when you or I hold a wine glass, we leave a little fingerprint behind, which is a fingerprint is basically a little smear of oils, hydrocarbons from our skin that we leave on the glass. And in exactly the same way, every time a bee lands on a flower, she leaves a little tiny smear of chemicals behind, not deliberately, but just, because she's covered in them. And obviously when a bee visits a flower, she takes all the reward. So any flower that smells of a recent visit by another bee won't have anything in it. And so actually what they're doing is they're using this cue as an indicator of which flowers are empty and which ones are likely to be full, and it just saves them by saving them having to land and put their tongue into the flower and then find there's nothing in it. It saves them maybe half a second a flower, but when a bee is visiting tens of thousands of flowers in a day, that adds up to a really big time saving and makes them much more efficient at gathering nectar and making honey than they would otherwise be.
How does one study that?
Well, good question. We did lots of things. I mean, the very first thing we did was we thought maybe they can simply smell the nectar, and they were just smelling the flowers to see whether if they smelled strongly of nectar, they'd land, and if they didn't, they'd skip on. So you can manipulate the amount of nectar in flowers. You can get these, they're called microcapillary tubes, which are just basically very fine glass tubes, and if you insert them carefully into a flower, they'll draw up the nectar just like a bee's tongue does. So you can artificially empty flowers, and then you can take nectar from one flower and you can artificially fill another flower. So you can manipulate whether there's nectar there or not. And we tried playing around with this, but and it soon became clear that the bees weren't able to directly detect whether there was nectar there or not. So, for example, if we got a flower that had recently been emptied by another bee and we filled it up with nectar and offered it to a new bee, she'd reject it even though it was full of nectar. So clearly they weren't able to directly detect how much food was in there. So it started to dawn on us that maybe it was something to do with the smell of a bee visitor. So we tried taking a recently dead bee and touching her against flowers, and that seemed to induce this repellent kind of effect. And then we did chemical analyses to find out what the chemicals were that were left behind, and you can synthesize them or buy some of them off the shelf, and we put the chemicals themselves onto flowers and we got the same effect, and so on. So eventually we kind of pieced it all together, but it took an awful lot of work.
So is the idea then that the bee footprint, the pheromone oils, whatever it is, would wear off by the time the nectar refills in a flower?
Yeah, well, so that's a very good point. Obviously, if a flower remained repellent and smelt of bees forever, then that wouldn't be any use. It needs to be a cue that wears off, or where a bee can detect how old the cue is. So if, for example, they're visiting a flower species that refills within about half an hour of being emptied, then they need to be able to detect whether that previous bee visitor was more or less than half an hour ago. And they seem to be able to do that. And so our interpretation initially was that the scent mark is kind of evaporating, the smell of bee is wearing off, and that they can judge an appropriate kind of strength to decide when to revisit flowers. In actual fact, that turned out to be completely wrong. There's some more recent work by some other researchers in Germany that showed that actually the scent marks don't wear off. They're still there. If you take the flower and stick it into an analytical machine, these chemicals, they don't evaporate quickly at all. They're very kind of heavy oils, which leaves a slight puzzle as to how the bees can possibly age the mark. And our best guess at this point, and it is just a guess, is that actually the oils aren't evaporating, but they're sinking in to the waxy surface of the petals, so they're becoming less easily detected by a bee visitor, even though the chemicals are actually still there. But that's kind of speculation, and we don't really know for sure.
Okay, now you spoke about just a ton of different studies in this book, which was fantastic, but I just have to mention, could you explain to people how one measures a bee tongue?
Yeah, it's fairly straightforward. I mean, it's much easier on a dead bee than a live bee, I have to say. They don't like it if you try and do it to a live bee. So different species of bee have very different length tongues, which is why it's important, because it determines what flowers they visit. Some have really long tongues, almost as long as their whole body, that they use to drink from really deep flowers. And so if you have a dead bee, you can simply unfold the tongue and measure from where it attaches to the base of the head to the tip of the tongue, just with little calipers, or even just a ruler is reasonably accurate. You can see it's next time you are in a garden in the spring and there are flowers and bees around. If you watch when you see a bee comes in to land on a flower, she flicks out this tongue, and in some species it's really quite short and pathetic. But other species have these really rather magnificent long tongues that they wave in front of them as they come into land.
You're listening to Science for the People, and my guest is Dave Goulson, author of A Sting in the Tail, My Adventures with Bumblebees. Stay tuned for more after these messages.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show exploring everyday life from a scientific perspective. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell, and I am happy to have Professor Dave Goulson with us today. Dave is the prolific author of various bee-related writings, and we've been talking about A Sting in the Tail, My Adventures with Bumblebees. Okay, now all the conversation has been happy so far, so of course I'm going to ruin that and ask you about our declining bee populations.
Sadly, bees have been in decline for quite a few decades now. Some species have actually gone extinct. In fact, the most recent global extinction of a bumblebee was of a species that used to live in California and Oregon, Franklin's bumblebee, which is now almost certainly gone forever. In Britain, we've had 3 species go extinct, and several others have declined enormously. And are sort of teetering on the edge of going extinct. So our bees are in trouble, and we should be really worried about that, because we depend on bees to pollinate our crops. So 3/4 of all the species of crop, the types of crop that man grows around the world, require pollination by some kind of insect, and usually it's bees. And so we're enormously dependent on these little things, and we need to look after them. And if they're disappearing, then that's a major problem. The reasons why they're disappearing are kind of complicated. There's one big one that everyone agrees on, which is that essentially there used to be way more flowers than there are now. Just to give you an example, 100 years ago in the UK, we had 7 million hectares of what's called flower-rich grassland, so sort of flowery hay meadows, the sort of meadow that you might skip through with a butterfly net, chasing after butterflies and bees or whatever, and the sort of place that bees love to live because they're chock full of flowers. So that was 100 years ago, 7 million hectares. Today we have about 2% of that left. Most of it was ploughed up and turned into farmland, so cereal fields or silage fields. And if you're a bee, then that's pretty disastrous, because basically most of the flowers that we used to have in the countryside we don't have anymore. So that's a big gradual change that's affected all of developed countries and to a large extent developing countries in the world, and made life pretty tough for bees. But then there are other issues which are kind of exacerbating the problem. One is to do with parasites and diseases. Bees naturally have loads of parasites and diseases, and they've evolved to deal with that. Naturally, they cope. But we've rather stupidly redistributed bee parasites around the world. Probably the best known one of those is the varroa mite, which is a pest of honeybees rather than bumblebees. But it's originally from Asia. It didn't naturally occur in Europe or North America. And European honeybees, which are the ones kept in the Americas as well, have really no resistance to this. It's a mite, a blood-sucking mite, and it spreads viruses from bee to bee, and it's generally a complete pain if you're a beekeeper. But so by accidentally spreading this mite around the world, we've created huge problems for honeybees. So that's a really well-known example. What's less well-known is that we've also redistributed a whole bunch of other bee diseases, many of which affect wild pollinators like bumblebees. And probably the most dramatic example right now is a really depressing story from South America, where, very foolishly, in my opinion, the Chilean government in the late 90s decided to introduce European bumblebees for crop pollination. Why they needed European bumblebees is anyone's guess, because there are native bumblebees in South America that would have done the job perfectly well, but they decided to import some European bumblebees, and they released them, and they've established in the wild, and they're rapidly spreading over the bottom half of South America, which might not have been so bad, but they didn't think to check the bees to make sure they hadn't got any European diseases. And of course they did have. And so we've accidentally introduced at least 2 new diseases to South America, which the South American bumblebees have no resistance to at all. And they're basically just being wiped out. And I mean, you could make a parallel with what happened 500 years ago when the first European people visited the Americas and accidentally took with them European diseases that the native populations of people living in the Americas had no resistance to. Exactly the same thing is now happening with bees. So that has really not helped. And there are other examples in North America and in Britain and so on as well.
Talk a bit about colony collapse disorder, because we do read about it often in the news.
Yeah, well, so honeybees suffer from many of the same problems that bumblebees suffer from. And there's been honeybees tend to get all the attention because beekeepers keep them, and they notice if something goes wrong with their honeybees. If they die, then they're not happy. So if a wild bumblebee nest were to die, chances are no one would ever notice. But when honeybees die, the beekeepers are upset, understandably and quite rightly. And so there's been a lot of attention drawn to the fact that in recent years there have been a number of incidents of unusually high rates of colony loss in honeybees. Now, this is sometimes called CCD, colony collapse disorder, which is actually slightly confusing because this term, colony collapse disorder, was first used to describe a particular type of honeybee colony death where the bees disappear, the adult bees kind of abscond. There's not a pile of dead bodies. They just abandon their brood and fly away and presumably die somewhere, who knows. And so actually there was another name coined which fell out of favour called Marie-Celeste syndrome for exactly the same thing. Unfortunately, a lot of people, when they have sort of synonymized bee colonies dying with CCD, but actually colony death can take many different forms. And sometimes the bees die in the hive, or there's a pile of dead bodies outside the hive, and so on. So it's a bit confusing. But strictly speaking, CCD is a particular type of honeybee colony death, as opposed to just any old honeybee colony dying. Either way, the causes of it still remain the subject of a lot of debate. My take on this is that the basic drivers of honeybee ill health are the same as the drivers of bumblebee problems. You've got not many flowers, and often relating to that, no great diversity of flowers. So bees living in intensively farmed areas, they don't have much choice in their diet is restricted to whatever crop happens to be flowering because there aren't many wildflowers. So, to take a sort of slightly silly example, imagine you were forced to eat sardines for a month and then chocolate for the next month and then turnips for the month after that. You probably wouldn't be very healthy and you certainly wouldn't be very happy. But poor honeybees, what happens particularly in North America is they're moved around from crop to crop. So in early spring, all they get to eat is almonds. They'll all be in Northern California to pollinate the almonds, and there's virtually no other flowers. So for a month, they'll just get almond blossom, and then they'll be shipped to Maine for the blueberry flowering, and at some point they'll be in Florida for the citrus and so on. So they get this really weird and unnatural diet. So that's no doubt one of the problems. That then there's all these parasite problems, which I mentioned Varroa already, but there are basically these diseases and parasites that we've accidentally brought in, which harm both honeybees and bumblebees. And then there are pesticides, which is a much more controversial issue as to just how important pesticides are in harming both wild bees or honeybees. I'm personally pretty convinced that they are contributing to the problem. I'm not saying they're the biggest problem, but they certainly don't help. We use a lot of pesticides in modern agriculture, a lot of insecticides in particular. And if you're a bee living in modern farmland, you don't have much to eat. You have a very monotonous diet. You're probably infected with some nasty disease from Asia, and you're being slightly poisoned all at the same time. And given that combination, then it's probably not surprising that both our honeybees and our bumblebees are sometimes looking more than a little peaky, or even dying. So I think that the range of problems that both wild bees and managed bees suffer from are pretty much the same. But people argue over exactly what's caused the honeybee colonies to die this year or last year, or in Ontario versus Great Britain or whatever. And probably the precise combination is different from time to time and place to place. So there certainly isn't a single cause of honeybee colony deaths. It's a combination of things that we throw all these stresses at our poor bees, and then we wonder when they die.
This is Science for the People, and I'm here with Dave Goulson, author of A Sting in the Tail, My Adventures with Bumblebees. Okay, so we're talking about all the dangers of importing bees. Is there any way to sort of mitigate some of those potential problems? Because from what I understand, we're running out of bees. And so it's important for various reasons, some commercial reasons.
Absolutely. There are basically three things that we can do. And one of the nice things about bees is that we can all help. When you hear about, polar bears, big trouble, the ice cap's melting, they've got nowhere to live. It's very hard for any of us individually to do much to help polar bears, or for that matter, tigers or pandas or great northern rhino or whatever. But for bees, you can. Everyone can help. In short, there are three things. Firstly, give them flowers. Secondly, we should avoid getting any more pests and diseases spread around the world. And thirdly, we should try and reduce how many pesticides they're exposed to. So that's it. Quickly, and numbers 1 and 3 of those are things that we can all influence. So don't use pesticides in your back garden. There's not really any need. Farmers might need them, but you don't need them in a garden. Plant some nice flowers for bees. If you've any kind of space, even a window box or a rooftop terrace, if you plant bee-friendly flowers, I guarantee that as soon as they flower, bees will find them, whether you're in the middle of a city or wherever you might be. And you're helping to give them some extra food, some extra nutrition, a bit of variety. Every plant you can plant for them is good. And there are plenty of lists available, really easy to find on the internet for the recommended flowers that are good for bees. My own website has the University of Sussex has some, but you'll find ones that are perhaps more relevant to North America easily enough. So that's a really easy thing that everyone can do. It's a little bit harder to tackle getting flowers back into farmland, but that can be done, and there are some farmers that are doing exactly that right now. There's some really nice initiatives in Northern California where they're planting hedges of flowering shrubs along the edges of fields. In Britain here we have schemes where farmers get subsidies for putting in flower strips along their field margins, up the little narrow strips couple of meters, 6 meters wide, of wildflowers or clover or whatever along the edge of an arable field. And all of these things work. Every patch of flowers we can put back into the landscape, it just gives bees a better chance. They can cope with some of the other stresses we throw at them if they've got enough to eat. So, we can all help. And for the species that have gone extinct, it's too late to do anything. But for the ones that haven't, we can save them, and we need to get on and do it. Okay,
so while most people in your position would just lament the state of the bee world, you started a charity instead.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got a bit fed up of, science is very kind of insular, and you do your research for a few years and you write a paper and it gets published in some crusty scientific journal that's only read by about 5 other people that work on bumblebees, and it doesn't actually change anything. And so I thought we needed to actually do something, to actually change the world for the better if we could. And so, back in 2006 now, I started a charity, the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, which isn't the most imaginative title I could have come up with, but anyway. And it's a membership-based organisation devoted to trying to, solve these problems for bees. And its biggest activities relate to trying to create more flowery habitat for bees and encourage people to garden in a bee-friendly way and so on. And it's got 13,000 members now, which I'm very proud of. It's gone great. And I kind of wonder whether, possibly there might be scope for something similar in other countries. In North America, you have the Xerxes Society, who do a kind of cover all insects, but do a really good job. So maybe you don't need a bee specialist charity over there. But it's worked really well in Britain, and it's nice to be able to. You can now visit places where the work of the trust has created, whole flowery meadows that you can walk through, and you can see thousands of happy bees feeding on the flowers. And it's really nice to know that that wouldn't have been there if we hadn't kicked this all off 8 years ago. So it really is possible to make a difference and help our bees.
Okay, I want to clarify. I'm going to do one more bit of debunking, but I think it's a good one. There's a quote that is often attributed to Einstein, although that's debatable itself. So, regardless, someone said, if the bee disappeared off the face of the earth, man would only have 4 years left to live. Now, that's not exactly true, correct?
No. Well, so firstly, it is often attributed to Einstein, but I don't think really there's any chance that he actually said that. As far as I know, he wasn't prone to making kind of wild pronouncements on topics that he knew nothing about. But who knows? Whoever said it, it's not true. Well, there's 2 things. Firstly, bees aren't going to go extinct. Some individual species will, but there are 22,000, and if we reach a point where all of the bees on the planet are extinct, then I think we will be gone, but only because we will have had to have basically destroyed the entire planet to do so. But just supposing that one could somehow magically get rid of all the bees in the world overnight, life would be miserable for us. We wouldn't go extinct, but quite a lot of us would starve. I said earlier that 3/4 of the plants that we grow for crops are pollinated by insects, but actually that 75% only accounts for about 1/3 of the bulk of the food that we eat by weight, because most of what we eat is wind pollinated. Think grasses, basically the seeds of grasses. So we eat tons of wheat and barley and corn and rice. None of which depend on bees at all. So without bees, basically, many of us would survive, but our diet would be basically bread and rice and porridge. So it'd be pretty damn boring. So we do need the bees, but probably humans could linger on without them, I guess.
Save the bees so we all don't have to live on porridge. That's a wonderful message, sir. Dave, it was lovely to have you here. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
We've linked to Dave Goulson and A Sting in the Tail on our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. In just a minute, we'll be back to talk about urban beekeeping and local government activism with Jocelyn Crocker, founding member of YEG Bees.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show exploring everyday life from a scientific perspective. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell. I'm joined now by Jocelyn Crocker, an instructor with the Department of Biological Sciences Technology at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. She's one of the founding members of YEG Bees, a group that promotes urban beekeeping in Edmonton. Before taking a beekeeping certification course in January 2014, Jocelyn knew almost nothing about bees except for the fact that she liked to eat their tasty products on toast for breakfast. Good to have you here, Jocelyn.
Hi, I'm glad to be here too.
So tell me a bit about YEG Bees.
Last January, so that would be January 2014, I took a beekeeping course. It was a 2-day weekend event that completely changed the course of my life, actually. And over the course of that weekend, we learned about how to do urban beekeeping. And in the city that we're in, it's not actually legal. And so some of the people who were in the course with me, we started this conversation and we asked ourselves, maybe we could pressure our city council to consider legalizing it. And so we formed YEG Bees, YEG Bees, as a group of interested community members who wanted to pressure our city to do a bee pilot.
Okay, well, we'll get back to regulations in a second, but maybe walk me through this. Why might one want to keep a beehive in their backyard?
Oh, there are so many reasons. The first reason, of course, is the honey, but actually that, in my case anyway, is the most a happy afterthought. One, people get into beekeeping because they're really interested in bees. Bees as organisms are really fascinating creatures. I could probably talk for a very long time about all the interesting things that they do and how they're connected with their ecosystems. But another reason why people would want to do beekeeping, and that's one of the reasons why I took the course, was to increase local food production. So my husband and I, we got into beekeeping through permaculture. We had taken up our front lawn and removed the grass and planted a food forest. And we asked ourselves the question, how can we maximize our food production? And so initially we thought we would just try and attract pollinators to our yard by planting bee-friendly plants. But then we thought, no, we want more bees. And so we got them. There's a couple things you need to do. One is I would absolutely suggest you take a 2-day bee course. There is so much to know about husbandry with the hives, and especially because bees right now are affected by some infestations of mites and other types of bee diseases that you need to know how to manage if you're going to have hives successfully. In an urban environment, you also need to know how to manage your hive to prevent swarming, which isn't dangerous but can be scary for people to see if they don't know about bees. Another thing you need to do is find a mentor, someone who is an experienced beekeeper. We've been really lucky with our bee mentors. We have a couple of them that are helping us out, and it's really great because while you can learn a lot in the bee course, there's a lot of gray areas for bees about decisions you can make about how to deal with, you see something and you feel like you need to deal with it, and so there's lots of different routes you can take, and having a bee mentor can help you make an informed decision. Another thing you need to do is learn the rules for your municipality regarding bees if you're going to do urban beekeeping. So there are some places where it is legal. There are other places like Calgary where it's not legal, but it's not illegal. So it's a gray area that the city has chosen to keep beekeeping in. And then there's other places like Edmonton currently where it is illegal. So we have a bylaw that says you cannot keep bees. And then the last thing you need to do is buy new equipment. You can find beekeeping equipment on Kijiji, but the problem with the bee diseases is it really is a good idea to buy all your bee boxes and all your frames new if possible.
And where do you get the bees?
Well, there's a couple different ways you can get them. One is there's kind of three sources of bees. One is called a nuke or a nucleus colony. And so that you would buy from a local beekeeper, or Calgary has a community hive purchase that happens every February where they collaborate with sweetacre apiaries in Salmon Arm, BC, and then they bring in hives from BC to Alberta. And then a second way you can get bees is through bee co-ops or PB marts, and you order what's called a package. So what comes in the mail is essentially a cardboard tube filled with bees.
Oh, the postal department loves you.
Yeah. And so usually they get shipped to the bee co-ops, and then you go and pick them up. And then the third way you can get bees, which involves you need to have your equipment in advance, but you can catch a swarm. In the spring and fall, if you come across a swarm or you hear about a swarm, the rule of beekeeping is if your bees swarm, they're no longer your bees. And so whoever catches the swarm, it's fair game for them to keep them.
So is it actually possibly a better idea to go after a swarm? Because I understand that there are concerns about what kinds of bees you import for a backyard hive. Like you have to be careful that they're not going to interfere with current bee populations, or?
Well, honeybees are not actually native to North America. They're brought in with the European settlers. So in that way, any honeybee you bring in is not a native pollinator. But one of the concerns with bringing bees into a northern place like Edmonton is overwintering them. And so catching a swarm or buying bees from local beekeepers or like through that community hive purchase, it's a good idea because there will be stocks of bees that have overwintered successfully. When you buy a bee package, they often come from places like New Zealand that have much milder winters.
So what about maintaining the hive? What's that like on a day-to-day basis?
Well, in terms of the time commitment, it changes over the course of the year. So, of course, in the winter, all I get to do is stare out through my window at my bees and kind of wave hello to them. So there's not much to do in the winter. Come spring, you need to be checking them once the temperatures are above 10 Celsius. And the time commitment for that is about an hour a week per hive. So you do a weekly hive inspection, and in that hive inspection, ideally you look at every single frame in every single box in the hive, and you're checking for evidence of disease and also looking for the health of the hive and evidence that the queen is laying and that the hive is happy and healthy.
Now, you mentioned the weather, and in Edmonton we have approximately 10 months of winter. So what do they do during the winter?
They don't go into hibernation per se, but insects, as the temperatures get lower, their metabolism slow down, so they certainly aren't as active as they are when it's in the winter. But what they form around the queen is a bee ball. And so there's this dense cluster of bees, kind of like, the penguins, how they form this
right
mass, and then the inside of the mass is warmer than the outside. And so there's slow migration from the outside to the inside, with the queen being in the middle. And they vibrate their thoracic muscles to generate heat. So the inside of that bee ball, no matter how cold it is outside, is about 34 Celsius.
So let's go back to the regulations around this. So, of course, my first question is, why is there a bylaw against beekeeping?
Well, actually, in our municipality, beekeeping, we've actually had a long history of it. So there were hundreds of hives in Edmonton in the 1950s, for instance. But in the early 1980s, they banned it because of safety concerns. And there are people who have a real allergy to bee stings. The bee venom, everyone reacts to it. So everyone gets swelling, everyone gets redness, and some people, if you get stung, your limb can swell, and that doesn't necessarily indicate a real allergy. The true allergies are actually quite rare, so it's 1% of 1% of people. And the reason why I don't want to say it's a non-issue, because for those people, a bee sting can be fatal. My understanding of it is that's kind of why they banned it. But because it is fairly rare, and because for urban beekeeping, the people who are most at risk at being stung are the ones whose hands are in the hive, it's not so much of a danger for people who live in the community that have stings. And just to put it into perspective, we had our hives in our backyard, and we had our children playing in the swimming pool, and we had our children helping us with hive inspections, and I had my hands in a hive the entire summer, and I was only stung twice. And my children were never stung. And none of the people who ever came to visit our yard for a barbecue or just spending time outside, there was never any concern that they would be stung.
So we do have apparently radical beekeepers in Edmonton, which warms my heart in a very odd way. So has there been any repercussions for this at all? Has anybody been arrested for backyard beekeeping?
No, you don't get arrested, but if you get caught with a hive, you get a letter from bylaw saying move your hive in 7 days or it will be a $500 a day fine. Our hives are actually part of the City of Edmonton's urban beekeeping pilot project. And so this summer, we got involved with the City Council, and on July 7th, they had a meeting with the Community Standards Committee, and they decided to do a bee pilot. And so it took them a little while to get organized and what the parameters would be, but they have about 10 hives in the city that are city-sanctioned and that have been inspected by bylaw officers, and it's part of the city's process towards legalization. The last communication that I've had with the bylaw group is that they're going to be presenting to City Council in March with the idea of giving them a report about how the bylaw or how the pilot project went and how they think the bylaw should be changed. So my understanding is it's not an if, it's a how they're going to do it.
Great. So YEG Bees is actually sort of a de facto lobbyist group as well.
Yeah, that's kind of why we started, because we wanted to do beekeeping, but we didn't want to do it illegally. Our biggest concern with underground beekeeping is that the community is quite closed and there's not an open way to ask questions or to share experiences or information. So we were part of these secret Facebook groups, but if you can't actually openly ask for help or to bring people to your house, to inspect your hive with you, it's just not the best way to proceed in our mind, especially with bee diseases. So for instance, there's some bee diseases that if you find them in your hive, you have to kill your hive, you have to burn all your equipment because it's this one spore-forming bacteria called American foul brood. And so if you find it, it's devastating. You have to kill everything, to burn everything. And in an underground situation, if you have inexperienced beekeepers who think they might have American foul brood, there isn't a way to ask for help and to get people in to see because your bees are there illegally. And so if it is legal or at least sanctioned by the city, then you can have open communication, you can have open supports. And in fact, that's kind of what's grown from this pilot is a lot more openness about urban beekeeping and more of a community and more support and more sharing of information.
So what other kind of challenges do you see? You have regulation, you have stings, you have parasites and diseases. What other challenges might you see from keeping bees in your backyard?
Well, certainly there is a public relations piece with your neighbors. For the most part, our neighbors have been fabulously supportive, and most of them have been over for a hive inspection, and we've shared some of our honey with them. We did have one neighbor who was really not impressed about the bees, and she had a lot of fear about them, and unbeknownst to us, she actually had a fountain that was tucked behind a hedge and her garage that we couldn't see, and the bees were visiting her fountain for water. And so because she wasn't thrilled with it, the bees going to her fountain were really upsetting for her. And so we had to kind of find ways to get the bees to come to our fountain instead of their fountain and to educate her a little bit about them because she was afraid of stings. But unless you're inspecting the hive with your hands in the hive, you're very unlikely to be stung by a honeybee.
Now, if you live in Edmonton, you can always contact YEG Bees for more information about how to go about setting up a hive. But most of our listeners are elsewhere, so where would you direct them?
Well, certainly many communities have bee co-ops or bee groups, and so I would suggest that they search either on Google or on Facebook or on Twitter to find their local bee group. The bee groups often are formed from the commercial folk, so the apiaries that are in the area, but there's often urban beekeeping groups or, such as the case of Edmonton, kind of a combination where it's both commercial and hobbyists who attend meetings, and that's a really good way to get connected to the local people and the local knowledge that is in the area.
And anything else you'd like people to know about backyard beekeeping?
One of the questions that you had emailed me that I thought was a really important one was, if you're in a place where bees are not legal, how do you work with your municipality to try and get them approved? I'll tell you the process we did. One was we contacted all of our city council members individually saying that we were interested in a bee pilot and would they consider talking with us and did they want to come and see our hives and all of those things. And we actually found, funny enough, that contacting our city councillors through Twitter was easier to get an immediate response than through email. So I would certainly say try through social media as well as through the regular avenues. And we actually had one councillor who came forward and was our champion. So he really helped push things through and helped connect us with the city council and helped open that communication. And another thing is looking at the infrastructure that's already there. So we worked with the Edmonton and District Beekeeping Association and got a little bit of support through them. And we also worked with the Fresh Council, which has a mandate for improving urban agriculture. So groups that push for urban agriculture are a very natural pairing for people who are wanting to push for bees because the two are very much intertwined with one another.
You'll find a link to YEG Bees on our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. While you're there, visit the links to connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Google+, and to iTunes, where you can subscribe to the weekly podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Science for the People.